Hi, everybody, and welcome. This is Jeff Dalto of Convergence Training and Vector Solutions, back with our recurrent webcast. We're in occupational safety and health, and in particular health today, and in particular mental health. Some of you may know I've done a couple recordings with a guy named Cal Bayer about issues related to mental health, depression, suicide, and the like, including one pretty recently. And Cal referred me to a collaborator of his, and that's Dr. Sally Spencer Thomas, and that's what we'll be talking about, or with today, I'm sorry. So Dr. Spencer Thomas is a psychologist, and she's an impact entrepreneur. She runs her own self-titled company, and in addition, is the president of a nonprofit called the United Suicide Survivors International. And with that, I'd like to say hi and welcome. So Dr. Spencer Thomas, how are you doing today? Thanks for joining us.
Oh, thanks so much, Jeff. I'm very grateful to be here. How are you today?
I'm hanging in there. It's a little cold here today in Portland, Oregon, but I'm fine other than that.
Nice.
So I wondered, before we get talking about issues related to suicide and suicide prevention at work, maybe you could just start by telling us all a little bit about yourself and how you came to be interested and involved in all this.
Sure. So like you said, I'm a psychologist by training, but I had been in the field of mental health for about 16 years when my younger brother and only sibling died by suicide. And at the time of his death, I'd actually veered away from traditional counseling. I was working at a university doing leadership development. And understandably, this life experience is one of those things that marks the life I had before and the life I had after. It became a calling for me to figure out what happened to my brother and to prevent what happened to him from happening to other people. And my brother was, by all external accounts of how we tend to measure achievement in our country, a very successful man. He was also an entrepreneur. He launched an insurance company in his late 20s, and it had gone national, and he was getting all kinds of accolades and all of this. But no one really knew that he was also deeply suffering with depression. And that ended up being fatal in the end. And so one of the things that it dawned on me, here I was, this person who had all this training and experience, and yet there was so much that I didn't know about suicide. And so one of the aha lessons is that you assume your mental health providers know a lot more than they do. Many of us are not adequately trained in specific things around suicide prevention. And it also dawned on me when I was looking at the data that most people who died by suicide were just like Carson. They were working-aged men who were white knuckling it through life's hardships. They were not reaching out for support, and certainly not reaching out for professional mental health support. And then they were often just having one attempt, and it was fatal. And so that seemed like a pretty important gap to fill. And so that led a bunch of us on this pathway to try to figure out how to get workplaces involved in suicide prevention.
Okay, good. Thanks for starting that off. Sorry about your brother. It's nice that you have done good work to try to help others as a result. Could you kind of help just introduce the topic by telling us a little bit more about mental health and suicide in the US in general, and maybe how that's been influenced also by COVID?
Yeah, sure. So we have about 50,000 people who die by suicide each year in the US, and that's an abstract number. I didn't really know how big 50,000 was. So I started to look up sporting stadiums. And it turns out in my hometown in Denver, Colorado here, Coors Field, where the Rockies play baseball, is about a 50,000 person stadium. And when you're sitting in that stadium and it's filled to capacity, you realize what a big number 50,000 is. But it's not just the people who died that are impacted. Suicide tends to be like a tsunami in families and in communities where people who are surviving that kind of loss are often massively disrupted, health-wise, work-wise. Marriages fall apart, kids drop out of school. It's the kind of life event that, of course, most people don't ever see coming. And when it happens, it is very complicated to cope with and grieve through. So we have a pretty big footprint around this in the United States. And when you look at other countries, we're pretty much middle of the road. But we're also an advanced country, so we would hope to have some systems in place to help prevent it. With COVID, many of us are talking about the perfect storm of stressors that have happened And when we look at wide scale disaster data, like what communities tend to go through when we have a large scale tragedy or disaster like 9/11 or Katrina, hurricanes and so forth, communities tend to go through a fairly predictable pattern of kind of anticipatory anxiety as we see things coming to us. And if you can remember back to March, we were hoarding toilet paper, we were acting very strange. And then as the things started to hit, there's this kind of surge of adrenaline that happens as a community. And the initial part of that arc is that we come in and there's all kinds of heroism and even like a honeymoon phase of people pulling together. You can probably also remember back to 9/11, there was this period of time where we're all traumatized and grieving, but we all as a world kind of pulled together in that moment. And so that was probably, you know, for many of us, mid-March to mid-May, where I don't know, here we were cheering on the first responders, people were making masks, delivering food to the elderly, we're doing all the good things. And then that was over. And then we've been in kind of a free fall of disillusionment and discontent ever since, that just doesn't seem to end. And when you look at all of these stressors that humans are being asked to face during this difficult time, it is a recipe for hardship. And the fact that it's been going on so long, whereas, you know, on a couple of calls this morning, we're just all exhausted. So when you combine like prolonged toxic stress, the uncertainty of the virus, the uncertainty of the economy, the fact that we can't touch each other or hug each other, we have very few outlets for relieving stress, and you know, all the things we used to do, not there, have many of us worried. So why aren't we predicting like escalating suicide rates through the roof? Well, human beings are resilient. And in fact, when we look again at data after long-term stressors, sometimes we do see suicide rates holding steady or even going down. Largely it's due to that pull together factor, but sometimes you just don't know. And when you get out in front of science and say these wild, you know, extreme things are going to happen, you can actually run the risk of developing a self-fulfilling prophecy. So those of us who are trying to be cautious in this space are saying, you know what, let's just prepare for the worst, hope for the best, and follow the data. You know, try to understand what the data are telling us. But already we're seeing things that are concerning to us. While we have only data right now for April and May's suicide rates, and so far they're holding steady, we have a lot of other leading indicators that have us really concerned. We have increases in domestic violence calls. We have, of course, massive fluctuations in unemployment. And we have actually there were decreasing calls from child welfare, which is actually not a good sign because the kids weren't in school. And that's often where they get identified by teachers and counselors. So the kids were still not being treated well, but they weren't being picked up. So then we've got issues of kind of long-term neglect and abuse there. We have pretty significant data of people drinking more during this period of time, and surges around increased firearm purchasing, which again, by itself, does not indicate a suicide risk. But if you're suicidal and you own a firearm, you're far more likely to die. So we have all these, but you know, leading indicators that have us really worried, so we're also looking for where are the protective factors, where are the communities that are getting through this, and seeing if we can learn from them. And it really usually comes down to people finding new ways to support one another through this. Although we're all very tired.
All right, good.
We all want to get things back to normal, and here we are facing the holidays, going, "Oh my gosh, it's not going to be over for a while."
But a shorter while, thankfully.
Yeah.
But I hear you, still a while. Okay, so you have introduced me to something called the National Guidelines for Workplace Suicide Prevention. We're going to drill down and learn more about that, and you're going to walk us through some key parts. But before you do, you know, maybe a lot of people don't even think that suicide is a workplace issue, and I wonder if you could just kind of talk about that for a second.
Yeah, like I said, in the early days, so this was like 2005 to 2007, we had this aha experience. Oh, it's the workplace, right? Because most of the people who were dying were working aged people. They were not reaching out to mental health services. They were beyond school at this point in their life. Many of them were also not reaching out to healthcare. So it was the workplace that was the most cross-cutting system. And that was kind of like, oh my gosh, the workplace is missing. And so when we went out to engage workplace, this again, 2007, 2009, we got this. Suicide? Oh no, that's not a workplace issue. That's a healthcare issue. People need to take that stuff up with their doctors. And we were like, but they're not. and they're coming to work. So maybe just as the workplace has gotten involved in other types of health issues, like, you know, nutrition and fitness and stop smoking and all these other things, perhaps you could also help save lives over here. But we were ahead of the curve, and workplaces weren't ready. And some of them were concerned about being the first one on the block with the suicide prevention program and having their competitors go, what, do you got a problem over there? We didn't have good data to support our claim because people weren't even entertaining this as an idea. And the Bureau of Labor Statistics was pretty much the only game in town where people were looking at how to address safety. Well, you have to have died on a job site. So this was not often what was happening there either. So we didn't have good data. We didn't have bold leadership. We didn't have case studies. And then at about 2012, this is how long we were banging our heads against the walls. We had a couple of bold people step up, and Cal's one of them. And there were a couple of other really bold leaders who had been impacted by a suicide death in their, either in their families or in their workplace, who said, let me be the first. You know, no one should die in this way. Let me be the first to figure this out. We don't want this kind of tragedy to happen, or people holding on in despair. And so they started to do the work. And as soon as they started to open up the conversation, it was like a floodgate. And we had, you know, contractors and other folks coming back saying, we had no idea. We had no idea how much our people were suffering. We had no idea how much our employee assistance program was not prepared for this. We had no idea. We had no idea. We had no idea. You've unleashed a dam here. And so a couple of people in particular said, we got to help spread a word and get some handholds for companies and professional associations. And that led to the development of what we call the Construction Industry Blueprint for Suicide Prevention. Now, this is like a 20-page document. It was just a high-level blueprint, you know, pulled together, you know, in a couple of months with a couple of passionate people, right? It's a small thing, had a huge impact, because when it was released in World Suicide Prevention Day 2015, it created something that people could push off against. You know, it was a document, it was a blueprint, and it started all kinds of conversations because it made it legitimate. And all of that happened, and we were in, like, I don't know, 30 trade publications in 18 months. Like, it was, people were ready and eager because so many people had been impacted. And we did all of that before we had data. It was about 2016 that the CDC finally came forward with a report ranking industry by suicide deaths. And they've had 2 other reports since, and very consistently, construction, extraction, you know, male-dominated industries are top, because it's about 80% of people who die by suicide are male. And that data, combined with the fact by then we had case studies, we had this blueprint, like, we were ready, and that made all the difference. So that's been the long trajectory. And today, you know, especially as we're going through this international crisis, I feel in so many ways that, you know, my life in particular was set up for this moment. And I've been waiting a decade, 15 years-ish, to serve in this way for employers and for professional associations who are really freaking out. And I say, no, we've got some tools for you. We have some pathways for you. You know, be proactive, you know, get some things in place, and you're going to be well situated when, you know, when this arises in your company. You can approach it with confidence and calmness rather than in reactivity.
All right, great. So we mentioned these guidelines, the national guidelines for workplace suicide prevention. And as you've explained to me, it includes 8 guiding principles and 9 practices. So I'm hoping you can walk us through both, starting with those 8 guiding principles.
Yeah, let's see. So the first 2 are really about the fact that this needs to be strategic. So one of the things that often happens in workplaces is there's some kind of crisis, right? Woo, somebody died, or we had a near miss, and then people get reactive and they want a training, right? Get us a training right now, stat. And I always say, no, an off-the-shelf, one-off training coming on the heels of a suicide death, and this training is going to say, here's the things you should have seen, and here's the things you should have said. It's probably going to make the situation worse, not better. So the first 2 are really about that this really needs to be a strategic integration. And by that, we mean that we need to bake it into other health and safety priorities. And that, secondly, it needs to be a sustained investment over time. Yeah, you're probably going to find some people that have been personally impacted and that are going to want to do this because they're making meaning out of their loss. And you're probably going to get some good volunteer engagement. And also, you need to dedicate some human resources into some financial resources to make it stick and to show that this is a high priority to do this work. We also have a guiding principle that we call harm reduction. So one of the things that's also true when workplaces started to get into the work of mental health, they think that, okay, well, the solution is to get all those quote unquote troubled people over to the counselors. And if we do that, everything will be fine. They'll get their problems fixed. It'll be great. And yes, that can be helpful. But our guidelines also emphasize the fact that workplaces can be very harming environments. When they're working well, they're amazing. They're a place of family and purpose and meaning and structure and resources. It can be great. But a lot of times workplaces actually drive people to despair because there's bullying and hazing and harassment and discrimination and really poor work design elements that prevent people from sleeping or seeing their families and all kinds of other stuff. So we say at about 50-50 measure, yes, help your people who are struggling through hard times get to supports, and also do a deep dive into your own culture, into your own environmental situation, and see if you have things that are driving that despair as well. And that leads us to the fourth guiding principle, which is this is about culture. And what we need to do is create or cultivate, as we say, a positive, caring culture that permeates through everything. The treat thy neighbor as thyself idea. It goes to the core of what companies are doing that are really finding that they're going to be able to retain and attract best talent. All that stuff applies here as well. It needs to be deep, not surface level, because we're talking about people's worst day. So those are kind of the first kind of upstream-ish guiding principles. And then we have a bunch of things on the downstream. The next guiding principle is really about dignity. That when people are having their hardest day or their family member is going through a really hard time in their caregiving, or they've just lost someone, we need to show up with dignity and respect for people and walk alongside them. Too often when it comes to suicide, because it's so unfamiliar and daunting and scary, people show up with fear. And we tend not to be very compassionate when we are being fearful. So being mindful of this idea of dignity. The other piece is that it's not good enough just to pull people back from the brinks of wanting to go. We have to also find ways that they can reclaim a passion for living, that their overall well-being is important. So that's another piece. The other pieces are that knowing your resources matters. It's not good enough just to have a page on your website with a bunch of links and nobody knows how to get a hold of the EAP or anybody who might work at that local addiction recovery center, or even where the peer support options are. So we really talk about cultivating this warm handoff, this deep engagement with people so that they know that the past, that warm handoff will be trustworthy. They're not just being bounced around. We call it the hot potato effect. When people get scared, well, I can't handle it. It's over my head. Let me bounce you to somebody else. And they do the same thing and bounce, bounce, bounce. And really all the person wants is connection and someone to listen. And because we're so scared, we pass them around. So having a deeper connection with the resources really matters. And then really doing the due diligence of making sure that what you're proposing out there is working. Doing the investment to iterate and improve and really have kind of the long-term view on it. So in terms of the 9 practices, again, we organize them between upstream, midstream, and downstream. And so upstream is really about proactive prevention, doing things that put things in place that increase the likelihood that this kind of level of despair is not going to happen, or when it does happen, everyone's ready to do the right things to get people back on the track quickly. So all of those upstream practices are often left off of the consideration because we're so focused on rescuing and going into where there's a crisis. But wouldn't it be great if we had fewer crises? Midstream is about catching things early and then helping people connect to a buffet of resources that will fit for them. And then downstream is about showing up in the crisis, prepared, confident, with the right resources. So on the upstream side, leadership matters, leadership engagement, and really modeling that through appropriate and heartfelt talking points. This matters here. And this matters to me because it Don't leave it to your wellness person or your safety person to deliver those messages. Leaders, you need to deliver that message and model the fact that this is important. And if you've been impacted, talk about that. Model that it's okay to talk about. Positive communication, putting communication in a positive frame. And at this point, I'm talking about like awareness communication. Sometimes, again, well-intended communication efforts focus on all the negative data that I was sharing with you earlier. They're dying, they're dying, they're dying, they're dying. And again, when that's the only message coming out, you run the risk of that self-fulfilling prophecy. So that message needs to be balanced with they're recovering. Peer support works, treatment works. You know, people all the time, every day, live through these things. We just don't hear their stories because for many reasons. There's a lot of stigma out there, good reasons for them not to share, but because they don't share, we don't know that it's true. And then the other upstream piece is about that harm reduction piece, about really looking at the environment and cleaning up some of those psychosocial hazards. The midstream level is really about identifying problems early. And the three things there, one is we really want people to be self-empowered to take ownership over this part of their health. With any health issue, that's our best route. When we're knowing it's a priority and we're aware of early signs and symptoms and we can manage our own health, wouldn't that be great, right? If we want to do that without shame, being proactive about it, like any other kind of health issue. So we provide people with that self-empowerment opportunity through self-screening tools and self-inoculation for crises and all kinds of other stuff. We also need to have people trained, and we want them trained kind of like CPR model where everybody gets a basic training. They get it regularly over time. And we don't expect everybody to do it perfectly when needed. We don't expect that for CPR either. But if we retrain people and train lots of people, the chances are better that when someone's having a crisis, somebody's going to raise their hand and say, I got this, I know what to do. And they're going to move in with confidence and competence and help sustain that person and connect them to life-giving care. And then that leads into the third midstream practice, which is really about building out an advanced peer network or an ambassador network or an ombudsman. Different workplaces or professional associations call it something different, but something in between the everyday worker and the professional services. There seems to be too big of a gap there. And for the person where that's daunting or foreign, or they don't think it's going to fit, that peer can make all the difference in the world. And sometimes a lot of the despair and the distress is resolved at the peer level. And sometimes that's all they need. Sometimes if they do need an extra level of resources to get there, they need a peer who say, oh, I've walked this path before. I know the way. Here's the trusted resources. Boom. And then on the bottom of the 9 practices are really things about vetting your mental health resources. Too many employers that I've talked to checked a box somewhere down the line and say, oh, we have an EAP. Do you know anything about it? Do you have any data on how it's utilized? Is anybody using it? Does anybody know about it? Is it any good? And they have no clue. So really understanding and vetting, creating a well-informed list. The next part is really about what we call mitigating risk. This has two components to it. One is, get those employment lawyers on board because actually doing the right thing is going to be protective for your company, and really understanding the laws around Americans with Disabilities Act and family leave and liability. People get all freaked out about liability and all kinds of stuff. So just getting, we have a team of employment lawyers and HR folks right now that are writing a white paper that basically says, do the right thing. And then finally, the last piece is really about crisis management, to have protocols, should there be a suicide death or an attempt, protocols for reintegration, protocols for providing people with trauma and grief support, and then working to transition from the crisis to prevention in a way that is sensitive to the people who've been most closely impacted. So that was a very long-winded answer to a very complicated question. Thanks for the opportunity.
Eloquent and comprehensive. Good job. So again, everybody, that was the National Guidelines for Worksite Suicide Prevention, 8 guiding principles, 9 practices. If you're watching this video, you will be watching it embedded within an article at the Convergence Training blog, and I will put links to all the cool stuff we're talking about right below here. Couple quick points. EAP, Emergency Action Plan.
So sorry. Acronyms are the work of the devil. I say it all the time and then I do it. Employee Assistance Program. So usually Usually employers over 50 employees will have this benefit where their employees can access free counseling, or sometimes it's an assessment and referral service. Usually there's a lot more services that they also offer. The employers just aren't aware: financial, legal advice, crisis incident debriefing kinds of things. The really important thing to know is that not all employee assistance programs are created equal. And sometimes if the bid goes to the lowest bidder, you got nothing. It's actually a waste of money. Top tiers can help with that early intervention, can help with that return to work plan, can get in if there's been a trauma or a crisis at work to help mitigate some of that. And they become really important, trusted partners. They don't solve the problems, they're partners in the work. But again, nobody knows. And that one of the other key things that I mentioned, I'll just reinforce here, is that knowing how your EAP has been utilized is a very good metric for you to track, not at the individual level, but at the aggregate level, because then you can see what kinds of stressors or what kinds of interventions you might need to do programmatically to support people.
All right. Couple, you talked about a lot, obviously, some of which is a good deal over my expertise, but some things that resonated with me in particular, because I'm a learning and development person. I loved how you began with training isn't always the answer, right? I do a lot of work in human performance improvement, and one of the tenets is like, don't automatically default to training. And in particular, you mentioned it and other forms of communication can actually be counterproductive and make the situation worse. I was just reading an article from the Learning Guild, basically making the exact same point about diversity training and talking about, when it can help and when it can't. So it's a good point to keep in mind that, I'm a learning development professional. I'm a fan of training, but it's not the silver bullet for every solution. And I liked how when you were talking about communications in particular, using stories, which can really be powerful to tell the nice side of the coin, if you will, and not just share all the depressing statistics, but tell stories about people getting better. So those are some of my big takeaways, other than the fact that
and
you thought about
positive
one
statistics.
Yeah.
The overwhelming majority of people survive this, and not only do they survive it, they grow through it. Many people grow through it. They have spiritual awakenings. They get out of toxic relationships. They find, deeper connections to people in their life they love, or new adventures that they would have never had before. I mean, all kinds of miracles actually happen as people recover from suicidal intensity. I want to go back to your comment about the DEI, the diversity, equity, and inclusion training, because I think there is very good connection there. Whoa, we need a solution right now. Let's drop in this training to an audience that is totally not prepared and potentially will push back on it. And what we've learned with some of the DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion training that we've seen to be more successful is people walk alongside. They listen first to say, where are you in this conversation? And then we walk alongside one another rather than you must see things my way. So same thing here. Sometimes I talk about, especially if you've been brought up in a place where suicide is thought of as a sin, or, only the really sick people have this, or whatever. You've got some misinformation or myths about it. You got to move people along gently, warm them up to the topic, get them engaged and owning it on some level, before you can do the good work of going to the deeper levels. And same thing with diversity training. When it's not strategic and when you don't bring people along, they can get very reactive, and then you're in a worse position than you were when you started.
Yeah,
that's right.
Exactly. That's exactly what the Learning Guild report said. And I'll move on to our next question, I promise. But it is interesting you talked about the how when sometimes people bottom out this way, they can then get better and actually get to places they weren't going to get to before. And I did not expect to be in this situation, but just between the talk I had with Cal not that long ago and the talk I'm having with you today, a buddy called me and he had just tried to kill himself. This is just a week or two ago, and
Wow.
I didn't know I was going to be in this context, and he seems to be identifying problems and making progress. So I can vouch for that right off the bat, and of course my fingers are still crossed. I'm still monitoring him, but yeah, he seems to have found the beginnings of a path. So I guess that does happen, and that's a good story. And so I certainly think about that story a lot when I'm sitting around the house these days.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that.
Yeah. So maybe could you give some tips for people for someone who might be considering suicide right now, or maybe someone who knows someone who might be considering suicide?
Sure. So this would be a training that we would maybe do over an hour and a half. So this is going to feel a little cliff notes-esque because it's going to be truncated, but it's still important to talk about even if limited time. So if you're someone who's experiencing what we call suicide intensity, so feelings and experiences and thoughts that are overwhelming to keep living, it's hard to stay, just know that you're not alone. There are so many people in the same experience, especially right now, and that there are resources there that can help. And that you don't have to feel this way. And if you've tried a couple resources and they're not helping, see if you can find someone to walk alongside you to help you persist, because I promise you there's something out there that will work. For some people, it's animal assisted therapy. For some people, it's religious and spirituality. For some people, it's getting sober and finding a 12-step group. Not all solutions work for everyone, but I'm certain there's something out there that will help you get through. And usually it starts with some kind of peer experience. So some kind of peer who's walked the shoes, but they're like, a solid half mile ahead of you, who are like, oh gosh, I totally remember that day. And I know this road to get through, and just to walk alongside. If you are worried about someone, there are really important things to do. One is to have a conversation with them. And this can be a scary conversation if you've never had it, but it goes something like this. You just find a quiet and safe space for someone, maybe take a walk or take them out to coffee or something like that, and just start the conversation with non-judgmental and conversation opening, like, I've noticed you're not like yourself lately. Okay, I noticed you're not like yourself lately. And sometimes when people are not like themselves lately, and you can list out some specific things, like you don't come out with us anymore, or you're drinking more than you usually do, or you're flying off the handle. When people aren't behaving like they usually do, there's usually something going on. So you can just say, so I'm wondering, is there something going on? And you can make it reciprocal, because I know you would do this same thing for me if the shoe was on the other foot. You'd be at my back. You would help me out if I was going through a hard time. So that's why I'm reaching out, because you're someone I really care about. And I want to be the one in your life, or a person in your life, that you can share these things about. So you have an open-ended conversation about what they might be going through. And you do that not by problem solving, not by jumping in and giving a bunch of advice, but just showing up and listening and asking what we call open-ended questions. Can you tell me about, give me an example when? I'm wondering what it's like to be you right now. That's a great question. I'm wondering what it's like to be you right now. And then that's it. Then you zip your lips. All right. So you let them talk. If they don't talk, it's okay. Like, at least 80, if not 90% of the deal is you showing up and showing how much you care. And sitting in silence is actually a very profound thing to happen. If they react to you like, what the heck, do you think I'm crazy? Right? And if they come all back and feel all offended or all agitated, just unpack that moment. You came to them with compassion and empathy and connection, and they're coming at you with their claws out. That's not about you. That's about them. And what they're doing is they're, defending against some vulnerability. They're saying, I'm not sure I trust you yet. So just stay the course. Stay in a place of compassion. It's very hard to stay angry and offended when somebody is compassionate, and just keep showing up. Now, here's the critical piece. You don't have to wait for all of the risk factors for suicide to be checked before you can go in and have a question of suicide. There are many people who have it at different levels of intensity. And it's really important to uncover that before it festers like any other health issue and becomes what we call like stage 4, where it's really hard to turn around. So you just go in and you say, sometimes when, and then you list the behaviors that you are concerned about, or the life experiences that are connected to suicide, right? So sometimes when people are going through divorce and they're drinking more than they usually do and they can't sleep at night, sometimes they're also thinking about suicide. So you just connect the dots. This happens to people all the time. Sometimes these things happen and then these things happen. And then you lift it up like a softball with wonderment, not with judgment. I'm wondering, is this true for you? Or are you thinking about suicide? Now, another piece that's really important in there is that you use the word suicide directly. You don't say you're not going to do something crazy, or you're not thinking about harming yourself. That's actually a different question. You can start there, but to really get to the meat of the thing, you need to say suicide. Because when you put it out there in a matter-of-fact way, it kind of becomes matter of fact, not this daunting thing. And you can't deal with it unless you can talk about it. So it does not put the idea in someone's head. That was a myth that got started a long time ago. In fact, the research shows it does the opposite. If someone is thinking about it, you put it on the table, it decreases the intensity of the thought, because part of it's having the thought and part of it is hiding the thought that becomes so anxiety provoking. So put it out there. I can deal this. We can deal with it together. That's the last part of the conversation, is that when people disclose their suicidal thinking, you enter the conversation with gratitude. Thank you. Thank you for trusting me. Thank you for valuing our relationship. I'm so grateful you told me. Then I've got you. I've got your back. We're going to figure this out together. We're in this together. And then lastly, I have some ideas. I have some ideas of things we can check out. And be knowledgeable. Know where your resources are. Know what the employee assistance program is. Know where the crisis line is, the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, the crisis text line. Know, a little bit about other resources in your community that are trustworthy. And if you don't know, go figure it out. Make some calls. Ask people what they've used. Get some very good vetted referrals. And then once you've made that connection to the resources, make a future date to check back in. I'm going to call you on Friday and we're just going to check in and see how it goes. Because if it didn't work out, I got some more ideas. Or, you know what, I really care about you and I just want to have coffee again next week. How does that sound? Right? Something like that. Something easy. But that future point in time also gives people that indication, oh, you really do care. You're not hot potatoing me. And it gives somebody another reason to stay. Somebody cares about me enough to check in the future. Okay, I will try another day. So very brief overview of things you can do. But these are things that have been tried and tested.
Okay, good. Yeah, thank you. So any additional resources you'd recommend people check out to learn more?
Sure. So workplacesuicideprevention.com is the website. So in addition to the things we've been talking about today, there's two other pieces that I just want to highlight. One is that it's important that workplaces and professional associations take a pledge, publicly declare that they're going to make this a health and safety priority. That does a couple of things, just psychologically, like, whenever you make a goal and you write it down, like your brain does stuff like, oh, I guess we're doing this now, right? Yeah. So making a pledge and then making it public. One of our employers that we worked with when he and his brother, who owned this, 1,500 person contractor, started doing this work, they came up very publicly together as a united front, the owners of the company, and they said, this is the year that our wellness priority will be suicide prevention. Here's why it matters to us, and then they talked about the personal reasons, and here's why it matters to our mission. And you're going to see a whole bunch of stuff coming out, right? So making that pledge within your teams, and then also more broadly, which they also did. The same company and a number of other agencies and so forth have come out and said, yeah, we're doing this. Yeah, it's a priority. And yeah, you know what? We're proud. We're proud to be the first. We're proud to be proactive here because no one should die in isolation and despair. And when anybody declares something that seems a little daunting like that, everybody goes, what? What are they doing? What? So many of these mental health programs they're fine, but they're like mental health light, stress reduction, and they're not bad. Like, we all need a little stress reduction. But if you don't call out the hard thing is invisible. So there's some courage, boldness, vision that happens when somebody labels the hard thing and does so like, yeah, why not? Why not? So that's part one. And the next step is kind of what we were talking about earlier, is to step back and listen. Before you jump in with your 9-point plan, listen. All right. And this is just listening in itself is such an intervention. Sometimes, when I'm partnering or consulting with employers, they're like, yeah, can we just move that along and get to the good stuff, i.e. the training? And I'm like, you know what, it's going to go a heck of a lot better if we spend some time listening to what people have experienced, listening to where the gaps are, listening to what the barriers are to the services that you're already providing, listening to where the opportunities are for the values that you hold and the lived experience that's here that offers an incredible inspiration of hope. Let's do that first, and then partner with people to do the 9-point thing, but with their voices, not some outside off the shelf thing. So that's a really important step. And we do that through focus groups and interviews and surveys and looking at the data within the company and all that, and really creating a plan before you just jump in and start doing stuff.
Okay, good. And final question, do you have any final words of advice, encouragement, or support for people out there right now?
Yeah, so for our leaders, be vocal, be visible, be visionary. there is no shame in stepping forward, but there's great risk in holding back and just hoping for the best. So that is a quote from a number of university presidents from a long time ago, trying to encourage each other to do the right thing in spaces that were hard. And for families and people that are struggling, it's hard right now because a lot of the things that would really work to get us through are those that physical closeness and connecting. But the world is resilient, and we have pivoted to online, the best we can do right now, online ways of recreating that. I know for myself, 5 out of 7 mornings, I'm on a support group in my ears. Zoom in with other people with lived experience has been really helpful. There's usually memorial things. If you've lost someone, you can get together and have shared grief in many spaces. The suicide attempt survivors community right now is coming out and loud and proud, and they're creating peer support groups for other people who've survived their own suicide attempts. We have new opportunities now for what we call impacted family and friends. So if you've been a caregiver or support for someone who's fighting to stay, you need your own support group. So there are opportunities out there. It's please be persevering and find the one that fits best for you. And if nothing else, call the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline if you're someone struggling, if you're someone who's worried about someone, and they'll be able to direct you to some local resources.
All right, great. Well, let me thank you very much for the coming here to share a little bit of your knowledge, and also just for all the great work you're doing. And for everybody listening, again, this is Dr. Sally Spencer Thomas. We're talking about the national guidelines for workplace suicide prevention. We've got the links down here for you below. And let me end by wishing you a happy holiday season.
You too, Jeff. I really appreciate you doing this, especially at this time of this difficult year. Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you for what you're doing. Talk to you in a little bit.